I now would like to welcome our keynote speaker, Professor Peter Tufano. He is the Baker Foundation Professor at HBS. He has a mere 3 degrees from Harvard. And he is going to speak to us, give us a talk about Kickstarts, how to unblock climate finance. So Peter, please.
Thank you. Thanks so much. So I'll come up here and hopefully this will work. So I'm thrilled to be here, but I'm also chastened because it's Friday afternoon. You've had a full day of programming. There's drinks ahead. And this may not be the title that excites you all. So let's see if we can enjoy ourselves for the next half hour. So just to give you a point, where we're headed, we'll spend about a half an hour. I'll kind of present a bunch of different things to you and then hopefully have a conversation. And I'll prompt you with some questions at the end. Is that fair? So I know this talk will come in 3 parts. The first part, I think most are familiar with, which is what are the fundamental facts around climate change. Then a quick transition to what's a framework that we can use to think about that, and that's systems change. But then specifically thinking about if you take Donella Meadows' approach to systems change, how do we map those specific things to actions we can take in the climate space? So kind of a play in 3 parts. Part 1 is dark. By part 3, maybe slightly more hopeful. Okay? And as you heard, I'm at Harvard Business School. I returned to Harvard a year and a half ago. I was absent for 10 years where I was at Oxford, where I was the dean of the business school, and then before that I was on the faculty of HBS for about 20 years after those other Harvard degrees. I'm also part of the Salata Institute. I noticed that we are one of your sponsors. So I don't know if maybe Dustin explained what the Salata Institute was, but it's our new cross-university initiative to try to draw Harvard together on teaching, research, and engagement. So, as I said, 3 quick things. What's the problem? We're alliterative, serious, speed, scale, scope, and system. What's the mental model we need to use, which is systems change, and then finally, what's the toolkit that we might want to employ to address issues around climate change? So the first part, I'm just going to really whiz through this, A, because I suspect you know it, and B, because it's incredibly depressing. So 5 S's. The first one is so obvious. You looked at Bangladesh this morning, which is serious. This is serious business. China, the USA, Pakistan, the Arctic. I think serious, done. We can tick that box off. Second, there's science back here, and I don't know if you had any scientists today, but there's great science here to explain what's going on. This is 2 quick charts that just try to give you a sense. Basically, if we look at CO2 levels in the atmosphere, they roughly correlate with degrees of warming, roughly. So what you're seeing there, this is from the Stern report, is that if we're at 400 parts per million, you can see the 5th and 95th percentiles about how much warming we're going to have, 450, 500. As of January, we're at 422, and we're rising trying to remember what rate we're rising at, but probably 3 or 4 parts per million per year, at least. So we're kind of between the first and second thing, which means that we are probabilistically moving away from 1.5 degrees and probabilistically moving towards 1.8. What that means is some of the stuff that you saw in the first part. So the way to think about that is something called the carbon budget. I don't know if a carbon budget is a term of art you've used before, but it's pretty important. So basically, we have, in the history of the world, basically emitted something like 2.5 thousand gigatons of carbon. And if we want to stay with less than a 50% likelihood, or within a 50% likelihood of staying in 1.5, we can still emit another 275 gigatons. If we're willing to go to 1.7, we can emit 625 gigatons. You can see how the math works. We're currently at about 45 gigatons a year. So basically the answer is we have 7 years until we kind of get past 1.5. We have 15 years before we get past 1.7, and we have 28 years before we get past 2 degrees. So again, this is why people call this the decisive decade. Okay. Speed is important. Next one is scale. So McKinsey has a variety of estimates about how much we're going to have to spend and what we have to do in order to decarbonize. So these are McKinsey estimates. We need 6 times as much wind power as we have now. We need 14 times as much solar power as we have now. We need 14 times as much EV car sales. We need 100 times carbon capture usage and storage, and we need 200 times in terms of electrolyzers for green hydrogen. That's kind of how much we need physically in order to address the issues that we're going to have. You can put that in perspective right now. Well, I haven't shown you we'll keep this number in mind. The total amount that's in climate finance right now in the world is about $1.3 trillion. And if you want to look at that, this is kind of hard to read. This little thing up here, that's adaptation. 63 billion out of 1.27 trillion is adaptation. The rest of it is mostly all mitigation. So I think you started this morning with a little bit of adaptation. So in the grand scheme of things, that's where the money's going. It's all going to mitigation. How big are these numbers? So the total numbers that we need are something like gross 9.2 trillion, net about 3.5 trillion. That equals 1/2 of global corporate profits for the next 25 years. That is 1/4 of global tax revenues for the next, through 2050. I think we'd all agree it's big. All right, so we've got seriousness, we've got scale. Scope. So what's our range of things that we can do in order to solve this problem? This is a classic thing I teach a course on a doctoral course on climate finance. This is one of the tools that students see. This is called the Kaya identity. So greenhouse gas emissions equals population times GDP per population times energy per GDP times emissions per energy. So which of these seems like the lever that we can actually play with? If you want to drive emissions down, what's our scope for actual work here? We're probably not going to recommend major population decreases. We don't really like the idea that we're all going to feel poorer. The next one works. Can we be more energy efficient? But most of our activity has to be on the final one, emissions per unit energy. And if you look at what's happened in the last 50 years, there's a lot of progress on some of this. So this is, those various elements. So if we look, CO2 emissions is up globally, 225% since 1965. So I know this is class X 73. So when you were still kids, since then, emissions are up 225%. But that's also because GDP per capita is up 155, population's up 130. But the other 3 numbers are somewhat more encouraging. We've actually driven down energy intensity by 45%, and we've driven down carbon intensity by 52%. So we have become more energy efficient, and we have been transitioning to greener sources of energy. But the sheer growth in population and GDP is driving much of what we're seeing. This is, anybody from MIT? Lee, you're from MIT, okay. So if you ever want to kind of get your hands on, to try to understand what these numbers mean, there's something that our colleagues at MIT put together called En-ROADS. I don't know if has anybody ever played with En-ROADS? Couple. So En-ROADS is basically a user-friendly, something called an integrated assessment model. It allows you to place, let's just do it for a moment. I'll just show you how it works. It allows you to basically play a little game with the planet. So if we just go here and go to this one instead, this is the real model. So see right now, if everything is business as usual, we're at 3.3 degrees, which is pretty high, but that's by 2100. And so the thing the students need to do is, okay, so suppose we go to 100% renewables, that will solve our problem, right? No. Well, suppose we got rid of all coal, that will solve our problem. No. Suppose that we just went completely nuclear. Nope. How about if we were really energy efficient? Nope. Helps. That's on buildings. What if transport became energy efficient? We're starting to make progress. You see where this is going. What if we planted a lot of trees? What if we reduced deforestation? What if we increased afforestation? What if we got really lucky in technology, carbon removal? You start to see how many levers you have to pull in order to make this actually work. So En-ROADS, kudos to my MIT colleagues. It's a great, not only teaching vehicle, but it's also a great vehicle. But it shows that we basically have to work on every front if we're going to solve these problems. Back to this. So, scope. So we've got seriousness, we've got scale, we've got scope. The next one is it's a climate system. So, I'm not a climate scientist, but if you think about the climate system, we have human activities that lead to various kinds of greenhouse gases that lead to heat, that leads to warming of the atmosphere and also warming the oceans. But warming the oceans leads to three things. One's evaporation, one is ice melts, and one is thermal expansion. Warm water is bigger than cold water. Okay, all that adds up to sea level rise, but at the same time, all that extra moisture also, well, actually, the melting also leads to something called an albedo effect, which is that dark things absorb more heat than light things. So when we get rid of ice and we have permafrost underneath, that's not good, but the permafrost also releases methane, and then that in turn, we got warming atmosphere, which leads to warming and volatile temperatures, and we put that all together, that gets to volatile precipitation, and that gets us to extreme weather, which causes all kinds of problems. But at the very beginning, the human activities also lead to certain kinds of air pollution that are actually beneficial, not for public health, but for warming, because they actually kill people, but on the other hand, they make the planet cooler. So this is a complex system. And we have to figure out where and how to intervene in the system. Okay, so system. I'm getting all my S's covered. Cover my S. No, that doesn't sound right. So if you think about it, we've got a serious problem that we need to act very quickly on. That's got huge scale in terms of both money and other things. Scope, we have limited scope in terms of what we can do, but massive scope that we have to do everything, and it's a system. And so, therefore, if you want to think of this in movie terms, the movie that this is about is this one. Everything, everywhere, all at once. I don't know how many of you have seen this. It's a great movie, and for this audience, and I think I can be part of you, the fact that a 60-year-old won the Academy Award as an action hero was great. So we really do have this problem that we have to be everywhere, doing everything all at once. Well, what do we do? You can throw up your hands now and you say, well, no, actually, we kind of seen this problem before. But before we do, what's the Harvard approach? So I talk to lots of audiences, and I kind of sometimes show them this flag. And I say, when you see the Harvard flag with the big H, what do you think, right? And the first word that comes out of their mouths is not Harvard, it's this one. But in the climate space, I think we need a different word, which is this one. Which is to say, we have to find the best ideas, no matter whether they came from Harvard or MIT or Yale or Bangladesh. It doesn't make a difference. We have to find the absolute best ideas. So in that spirit, what you're going to hear for the rest of the next 17 minutes or so, some of it's my stuff, but some of it's colleagues at Harvard, some of it's colleagues from other places. This is just the best I can find from everywhere that may be able to solve some of those problems. And the place we start is about systems. People have been thinking about systems and systems change and systems leadership for a long time. Again, hats off to our colleagues at MIT. Systems dynamic folks at MIT have really pioneered how you think through systems dynamics, which is feedback loops, and Peter Senge and others have thought about systems leadership, and I'm going to draw upon all that. If you think about a systems model, this is a system model of energy consumption in China. And typically what you want to do is first draw these complicated maps, and then you want to ask, where can I intervene? So for example, maybe I want to intervene right there in coal, and maybe I want to get rid of coal, and maybe I want to intervene there and increase fossil fuels. So you're looking for intervention points. And you're hoping those intervention points will be useful, and also that they're not going to cause too many negative feedback loops. So that's your job. The good news is people have been studying this for a long time. And there are many people who have studied how you actually rip apart systems and solve them. So for example, our colleagues here at Harvard, Jane Nelson at the Kennedy School, has written a really very good paper that summarizes all the different approaches to systems thinking and systems leadership. I'd recommend it strongly. So she wrote it with a former colleague from Harvard, and a short version is posted on the World Economic Forum website. But there's another one, kind of an earlier one, and I'd like to use her framework. It's a woman named Donella Meadows, who's no longer with us. And so her model was, we need to leverage the system. So we need to there are various things we can do along the way in order to affect systems change. So she broke them up into 3 big buckets. The first bucket is practical things. This is what most of us study. Metrics, materials, and standards. Change measurable things, change the flow of resources, and change feedback loops. So most of us, like an engineer, this is how or a business person, this is how you'd start with. Like change the kind of the stuff that we touch all the time. The second level is structures. Change information, rules, and power. Create new feedback loops, change rules, and democratize innovation. And the third level of levers is not about practical or structural. It's actually, she calls it cultural or intellectual. It's changing how we think. And I think you heard a little bit of that in the last panel. At least I thought I heard some of that in the last panel. How is it that people respond to trauma? How is it that the way they think changes? And there, change the purpose and change public mindsets. So really, between now and when I ask you for questions, let's just go through those 7 things that we might be able to do and see how many of those resonate with you. So the first one, I'm going to start at the bottom and work my way up. Remember, it's change measurable things. I'm going to talk about disclosure policies. The next one is change the flow of resources. I'm going to talk about public-private financing and blended finance. Third is, the third and fourth, change feedback loops. I'm going to talk about materializing demand. The next one up is change the rules. I'm going to talk about tax and externalities. The next one up, and by the way, if I was a real economist, that's all I would talk about. Then if I go one more up on democratize innovation, I'm going to talk about collaboration. And then the next level up, it's about shared responsibility. And finally, changing mindsets. Believe it or not, I want to talk about ethics and finance. So that's where we're going to go. We're going to kind of take a romp through those 7 different levers and see if any of them resonate with you. And I'll try to do this pretty quickly. So let's start about measuring things. Old saws, if you've been around a business school, these expressions are kind of common to you. You manage what you measure. If a tree falls in the forest and nobody, we've got to manage stuff. The good news is there's a lot of activity in this space. So not that you need to know all these various acronyms, but basically a bunch of, in this case, independent private groups came together to form reporting standards. That was consolidated and then handed over to something called the International Sustainability Standards Board, which is part of the International Rule Maker for Accounting. And now they are taking these soft standards and turning them into hard standards. It's just the first step. We need data. And you've seen in the United States that this hasn't been well received. So it's simply the first step in Donella Meadows' kind of levers. So that's where we start, data. Okay, that doesn't take us very far. Secondly, let's change the flow of resources. So at the business school, and the business school I used to run, it's about how do we change human capital? How do we get people who are more educated about this? And that's the reason I teach a doctoral course across 135 schools, to try to get more faculty members to be able to teach this. But I want to focus on financial capital for a moment. This is a kind of some graphics that the UN puts in their website because they're so proud. It's a $90 trillion investment in infrastructure. And by the way, if you invest $1, you're going to get 4 back. And if you talk to people in the UN, they think that's a great deal. And if you talk to people in finance, they say, maybe, maybe not. Because is 4x an attractive return? Well, these are the questions that somebody in the private sector would ask. Well, for what and how much risk? Oh, by the way, over what time frame? 4x over 4 years is nice. 4x over 40 years is not so good. Is that a pre or post-tax return? And then relative to what alternatives? So it's funny because the UN folks think that this is just an obvious no-brainer that everybody would jump to do this. But the private sector is not really jumping that much because they see a lot of risk. There is a solution that's emerging around this, and that is, on one side, you have public finance that is more than happy with returns like this. On the other hand, you've got private finance, which is saying maybe a little bit risky. And in between, we're seeing the creation of what's called blended or concessional finance, which is putting together different parts of the capital stack so that folks who are willing to take lower risk can take a different part of the capital structure. Folks who want higher risk are going to take another part of the capital structure. And perversely, it's the public sector is going to take the higher risk so that the private sector can take the lower risk. So this is, in a nutshell, concessional or blended finance. So this is how we change the flow of resources, because we need a lot of money. We need 3.5 trillion extra dollars. Okay, how do we change feedback loops? A feedback loop is, something happens and it leads to something else and it's something. So typically the way the feedback loops happen for new products is that I, as a supplier, come up with a new product and then I try to convince the world that they should buy my product. That's a kind of a normal thing, right? I go out and I try to convince them to do that. But what if all the buyers got together and they tried to convince the sellers to create new products? And that's what you're seeing. So rather than just supply side or push incentives, granting money for a new fund to fund a new plant or investing for a new plant or startup funds, what if they started to look like demand side? So at COP26, Glasgow, it was interesting because a coalition of governments and private sector firms got together and said, we're really interested in a bunch of products. We'd like to see light utility vehicles that look like this. We'd like to see carbon capture that looks like this. And they created a group called First Movers Coalition to do this. Or maybe they go a little further. They say, if you create the product, then I'll buy it. Not just I'd like to see it, I'll buy it. And an example of that is something called Frontier. So Frontier it was founded by a firm called Stripe, but it's a consortium of 6 or 8 firms at this point. They put up about $1 billion, and they've said, we'd like to buy carbon removal, not offsets, removals. And so what they said is, we've put together a fund to buy this stuff. If anybody has product, let us know, because we're in the market. This is turning the entire usual model on its head. Instead of it being that suppliers are beating down the doors, this is buyers beating down the doors. And in fact, in another movie analogy, this is exactly the opposite of another movie from some years ago called Field of Dreams. But in Field of Dreams, the model was build it and they'll come. This is come and they'll build it. And this we're seeing emerging as an important phenomenon in climate. It reduces the risk to new companies and to old companies, and it says, there is an established market here. So this is, in my at least reading of climate finance and things that need to be done, one of the more super interesting and informative things that are going on. I'm writing a bunch of cases on this. The next thing is changing the rules. And the rule that every economist loves is carbon taxes. So quickly on that, the question you have to ask is, what's the cost of an extra ton of carbon? I'm sure you've heard social cost of carbon as a term of art thrown around. We identify the marginal impacts, and right now the Biden administration is estimating that every ton of carbon has an economic value, cost to society of about $190. So what are you going to do about that? Firms don't have to pay it. So think about a current income statement. I have revenues of 100 and cost of goods sold of 40, my profit is 60. But what that leaves out is the fact that, my social cost of carbon is actually 80. My profit, if I accounted for social cost of carbon, would be minus 20. We don't have to do accounting like that. Maybe someday we should, but we don't. So there's 2 things you can do. You can either tax them, but the other thing that economists have written about for 60 years is you can bribe them. The IRA is simply, that's Pigou, that's Coase. Coase is a famous economist. That's the IRA is mostly just a Coasian bribe. It's to basically provide incentives, but not negative incentives, but positive incentives. And you'd say, okay, well, like, how would I actually use this in practice? Let's do a concrete example. Let's say we wanted to get rid of all coal. We would say, what's the total cost to shut down all coal mines and invest in alternatives? And I think Dustin may have talked about this morning. And then we'd say, what's the social benefits of shutting them down? And we would be serious about both sides of the equation. And there's a paper that does precisely this. So on this side, they estimate it would cost $29 trillion to shut down the coal industry. You have to pay off the shareholders. You'd have to make sure that the employees were good for the rest of their lives. You'd have to buy new technology to replace the coal technology. And that's $29 trillion. That's not a small amount of money. But the social benefit is $114 trillion. So if we had the will, and ethically this kind of bothers us, we should pay off coal mines in order to get them to stop producing. But this analysis is pretty clear. Yeah, if you just bribed them and said, okay, here's $29 trillion, shut down, the world would be better off by about $80 trillion. And by the way, that's at an $80 social cost of carbon. If you use 190, obviously the number's going to be a lot bigger. So this way of thinking, which is that, how do I use not only taxes but bribes? That's a way to change the rules. Let's try a couple of other things. Democratize innovation. Our general rule is that firms compete. But if you look at the history in this space, it's all about firms that collaborate. So how do we think about that? What can collaboration buy us? So we have a new paper on this. You can build capabilities. Most firms don't know how to do the things they need to do. You can create ambition loops. You can't collaborate on actual projects. Well, you can't, set prices because that's called antitrust. But you can collaborate on ambition. You can signal demand. That was what I was talking about before. You can define standards and accountability. You can facilitate policy. All this is what coalitions do. They are sadly under attack in the United States for both antitrust and fiduciary duty grounds by 27 attorney generals and more than 100 bills that are kind of in place right now. But our argument is these are the things, the positive things that coalitions can and are doing, and it's interesting to see them. You can also democratize innovation through climate tech. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. There's a lot of really interesting climate tech firms. So what if we kind of moving up the ladder? So we started with very mundane things, change disclosure, and then we kind of got to taxes. And what if we just changed purpose altogether? So since the 1980s, the dominant idea is shareholder capitalism, shareholder primacy. Firms maximize the value of the firm and everybody's better off, or as Milton Friedman put it, the business of business is business. But again, the advantage of teaching a doctoral course in here is you remember what this is about. That's assuming that it's Pareto efficient. I won't kind of remind you what that means. If and only if markets are complete, there's no unpriced externalities and markets are competitive. But there's two of these that are deeply problematic. Markets are not complete. Oh, and if governments redistribute income. But markets are not complete because future generations don't trade. Your grandkids' kids don't trade in the market today. So I'm afraid those markets are not complete. And furthermore, there are massive unpriced externalities. So the business of business is not business. The business of business is something else. You can't rely just, in many markets, you can rely on just competition to solve your problems. Not when there's kind of those two criteria that are gone. You've got a missing market, which is the future, and you've got huge unpriced externalities. So, but we've been teaching this for a long time, 50 years. And everybody believes it, right? Let's see. This actually came out today, so I'm pleased with this. This is in the Harvard Business Review as of today. So if you haven't picked up a copy at the newsstands, you'll get the early answer here. This is a piece I wrote with some colleagues. So we went to 28 different countries and we asked people, what do you want business to do? Like, what would you like it to do? Because, is the business of business business, or is it something else? So across 28 countries, is it about all stakeholders or is it about shareholders? Across all 28 countries, you can see those countries, 77% of people say, the purpose of business is to worry about all the stakeholders. And specifically, customers and employees are at the top of the list. When asked, for example, if interests conflict, who should win? Shareholders in every country never get above 11%. So while we think that the dominant model, the intellectual idea that is accepted by everybody, is something that some of us might have taught in business schools, I'm afraid it's not accepted by virtually anybody. But they're not crazy. When asked what the primary role of business is, everybody knows the primary role is economics. It's to create jobs, to create products, to create innovation. So they're not, mad people. But they say a close second role is societal responsibilities. And this is like 28,000 people around the world. It's maybe meaningful. So maybe if this actually works, and rather than being just a crazy idea, this is actually the dominant idea that most people around the world believe in. But those of us who teach it sometimes don't ever know that because we've never stopped to ask anybody. All right, so we're moving up that hierarchy. We've done instrumental things and now shared responsibility. But the last thing in this list is how it is that we're going to change the way that people think. So you're going to think this is really bizarre. How many of you have ever studied the time value of money? Everybody? Everybody knows it, right? $1 in the future is worth a lot less than $1 today, right? This is just the normal way of thinking about things. So, this is a graphic from the IPCC report. It says that, people born today are going to experience a lot of the future, but I don't want to focus on that. So if we think about $1 in 30 years, or 50 years, or 70 years, at 2% or 4%, $100 that I'm going to get in 70 years is worth $6. That's all. All right, that's just kind of normal discounting. 4%, by the way, is the current risk-free rate. 2% is the current real return. Right? And anything that goes out 100 years is pretty much worthless. And that is the economic logic we use for everything. But the problem is, that means that your grandkids are worth nothing. And so ethicists have worked with economists to try to figure out something called what a social discount rate is. Because to the extent that you use any discount rate that's even mildly material, you're going to fundamentally say that ethically future generations don't count. And so therefore, and I'm a finance professor. I taught for 30 years. I never heard of this concept. Right? But this is how you have to think about these things, because fundamentally, in order to do the analysis that we need to do, we have to rewire our brains and think about, no, it's not about market discount rates. We are fundamentally valuing life. Because if you think about it, the logic behind time value of money is that dollar tomorrow is worth a lot less than today because I can take $1 today, put it in some investment, and I'll earn more. But you can't do that with life. But we're going to use the same logic for life. So we have to fundamentally alter how we think on something so fundamental as just the time value of money, which is one of those things that everybody agrees. Of course, that's something we have to understand. So if we put all this together, we have all these levers. And I think if we use all of them, we actually stand a pretty good chance. So where does that leave us? I've ticked off the exam for Donella Meadows. All right, but on the other hand, I think we're missing two things. I'll just close with those two things. The two necessary final things beyond all that. The first one is hope. I like this quote from Cory Booker. It's in his book, United. And I think he says it in a nice way. Hope confronts. It does not ignore pain, agony, or injustice. It's not a saccharine optimism that refuses to see, face, or grapple with the wretchedness of reality. You can't have hope without despair because hope is a response. Hope is the active conviction that despair will never have the last word. We need hope, not optimism. We are not on a path to optimism, but we need hope. And the second thing we need, and this, I was at a meeting yesterday. We were talking about all the things we're doing around the university on climate. And someone said we need to do stuff on policy, and we need to do stuff on science, and we need to do stuff on kind of public health. And I said, we're missing something in this conversation because the thing that we don't have is leadership. Right? We've talked about all the technical stuff, but what we've lost is the conversation about leadership. Now, there's lots of leadership quotes. But this one I thought, in the systems space, sits pretty well. This is the former, I think, CEO of Herman Miller, the furniture company. First responsibility of a leader is to define reality. The last is to say thank you, and in between, the leader is a servant. Now, you might think that doesn't work in a corporation setting, but in a setting where we have to get a lot of other people and work together, this is maybe not a bad way. So putting this all together, I think that there is a lot of work to be done. But on the other hand, we have a lot of levers. And if we use those levers across the board, I think we can make reasonably good progress. Now, I know that this was really high level, so why don't we take some time and questions and comments and reactions if we could. Thank you. Yes.
During lunch, I was talking to a lady, and there was this interesting connection between science fiction, recent science fiction, and climate change. And the argument you put in there, not to spoil the book, is happening in one interesting book called Ministry of the Future.
Yep.
Ministry of the Future. But the issue is that this whole thing of quantification is very important, it's very useful, but it can also lend itself to other issues, right? Mm-hmm. How can we do it in a way that we ensure the whole system responds, and how can we build some little bit of a protection in the system so that it doesn't get out of hand?
Mm-hmm. So I think that's a great question, and it comes to whether we want narrow or we want broad metrics. So for example, if you look at ISSB, they've started with very narrow metrics. It's about carbon. Their roadmap is to have much broader metrics about biodiversity. And if you look at other programs like, I'm trying to remember what the acronym is, but basically, the World Development Index, there's a full range of metrics we're going to use. I think the trade-off is going to be simplicity against richness. And I think we're going to have to, since we're in the metric construction business, the nice thing about this, we're going to be constructing metrics for some time. So the question to ask, we're going to have to ask ourselves all the time. What's the unintended consequences of just measuring, say, carbon? So we might forget that there's methane, and methane is even more dangerous than carbon, even though short-lived. So
I wouldn't like to have reduction in actuarial science.
You wouldn't want to have
reduction in actuarial science.
Yes. No, that's true. It's true. On the other hand, no measurement's going to put us in an awkward place too. So I think we're kind of in that damned if we do, damned if we don't business. Yes.
Hi. If you were in a room with the top corporate leaders in America, the 10 top and the 10 top mayors representing big cities, middle cities, teeny towns, what would you say to them in terms of what actionable things can they do as leaders to enact this plan?
So I've never been in that situation.
Good.
Do I have a magic wand? First thing I would tell them is that the pressure that they're feeling in order to not do this stuff is real, but it's only expressing the preferences of a relatively small amount of people. That's what the survey data would suggest. So to the extent that they think they're trying to do the right thing, they should, as much as they can, resist the short-term pressures that they're feeling from attorney generals and from certain members of the House. Second, I'd say, you can, I think, trying to appeal to their better spirits, maybe you could do that. But I think the other way that I would say to both of them is, this is a material risk. This is going to affect your business. Your future is going to depend on whether you address this right or wrong. So you might as well not only get on the right side of history, but get around the right side of business, because I think that's probably going to have more incentives. If I could and I had a magic wand, I would in fact tax them so that they could see it, because until they see it in some kind of measure, they're not going to appreciate that the damage that they're doing. So there's a principle called the polluter pays principle. It's kind of fairly well established, but not implemented. So, I'd like to say I'm just going to show them all this data and look, this is what the world wants from you. And of course, it's ethically the right thing and they're going to do it. But I think you have to be more realistic than that. You're going to have to show them that it's in their best interest too. Either that or you hit them over the top of the head. Yes. Small room, I can probably hear you.
Thank you very much for that presentation, especially about the discounting life, which I think is a terribly important point. Your view represents how much of the views of people today teaching finance and business administration in this or other countries. In other words, are we still seeing the inertia of older views so pervasive that it's hard to turn the ship around?
So I'll answer that at multiple levels. First, I was a dean for 10 years at a small school, Oxford. It's a small business school, big university. We transformed the whole curriculum in a few years. That was not that hard to do. At Harvard, things move a little bit more slowly. We are making change. But if you ask the dominant mindset is not there yet. And I am trained in finance. I spent most of my life in finance. The place that's probably the slowest to change is finance. Accounting is actually moving quite fast because our accounting colleagues see, we're going to be really important. I have a T-shirt that says, accountants will save the world. Somebody gave it to me. They see it. Folks in operations, they see it too. But the entrenched Milton Friedmanites largely sit in finance and economics. So that's where I think change is the slowest. But it's happening. Not fast enough for my take, but it's happening. It's not inherently impossible. So the course that I teach, the doctoral course, we have 2 former presidents of the American Finance Association, 1 former president of the European Finance Association. We have fairly heavy hitters who are also great researchers teaching to send a signal to the students that this is not a crazy thing to study. So I think we're chipping away at it, but not there yet. Yes?
I want to follow up on Jim's question and say, and what about the students?
Students are largely there. That's not a problem at all. So I came here late because I was teaching today. Today we talked about discrimination at Airbnb. We teach about climate. Both my students at Harvard and my students at Oxford, they're largely there already. A few of them are still kind of dyed in the wool. I want to say libertarians, but that's not giving them justice. But they have a fairly kind of straight line view of the world, which still use quite a bit to Milton Friedman. But most students these days, no, they get this. They understand that their future is kind of looking quite bleak. So no, I'm not worried about them. They get it. It's their professors I worry about more. They are the future corporate leaders. At least the ones I'm seeing now and the ones I've seen for certainly the last 15 years, they are much more attuned to this set of issues than ever before. Certainly relative to when I first started teaching 30, 40 years ago. Yes?
So, my classmates, Jim and Peter, are focused on mindsets and who might be in a position to change their mind and then change the world. But I'm looking at time spans. So how quickly do we have to, what critical mass of mindset and decision makers do we have to change within what periods of time to actually achieve the change that we need to achieve? Because, what's the present value of a leader 20 years from now?
That's why I presented these all at once. I think that, the long play is that we will not be out of this climate crisis in 5 or 7 or 10 years. We're going to have to deal with this for a long, long, long time. And so you need to do immediate things like metrics. You need to do immediate things like tax policies and or bribery policies. You need to do medium-term things, like, for example, this demand aggregation. You need to do long-term things, which is changing mindsets. So I think you have to do it all. If you're an educator, the place that you have the best way to play is with students, but also with executives, because from a business school, you can get up close to executives and help them think through different ways that they're doing their work. So I don't think that the solution to this problem is teaching 28-year-olds. No, I don't. But it's part of a long-term solution, but you have to do the other stuff. So metrics, taxes, incentives, coalitions, all of that whole set. That's why I don't see this as pick one. Going back to the En-ROAD simulation, literally you have to do them all.
Run a Monte Carlo simulation on each one of those levers.
Yeah.
And how likely each one was to happen within a period of time. What would be the aggregate positive effect you think you could achieve doing everything all at once and failing at some, succeeding at others?
This is the difference between hope and optimism. I can't put a number on that.
But an emotion on it.
So when I look at, for example, some of the new technologies that are being developed, they are exciting. There's Commonwealth Fusion is within 20 miles of here. If their technology works, it will fundamentally create a new source of energy that is as green as renewable, but is continuous. That would be great if they can do that. There's people who believe that there's natural hydrogen that can be extracted from the ground. If you can do that without electrolyzers, that's fantastic. But in the absence of that, there's a lot of blocking and tackling. A lot of blocking and tackling. So we just have to, everybody's got to figure out their part of the puzzle and work on that. So I can't give you odds. Yes?
Issues of, thank you, ocean rise, global warming, threatening of all humanity, lend themselves to quantitative thinking, and yet the particular results or techniques, technologies that you use to go about this tend to have heterogeneous effects and greater for some populations than others.
Yep.
For example, indigenous peoples have their sacred lands, and
Yep.
People who are not so concerned are more interested in lithium than in these ancient ways of life. And speaking of life, you seem to assume that it's human, but in fact, there are many sentient creatures, to use a loaded word, creatures out there. And how do they fit into all that you've had to say today? Thank you.
So largely I've focused on mitigation. I full up say, this was largely about mitigation.
But it'll be heterogeneous.
I do understand that. And there's issues around adaptation and loss and damages and biodiversity, but also kind of beings that aren't human beings. I get all that. For this talk, I focused on the other thing. But it doesn't take a lot to connect them. So for example, at COP 28 or 9, whatever the one I was just at in Dubai, one of the most chilling sessions I went to was by a research scientist from the Potsdam Research Institute. They study nature, basically. All the analyses that you've seen in terms of the amount of global warming and the ability of the planet to absorb carbon are assuming that nature still holds the line. But nature will not hold the line under many scenarios, in which case all of our work is well underestimated. So I don't disagree with any of the things that you say, and they're important. Maybe 2 or 3 other talks, we can get into some of those. But there is something quite immediate about this one that is irreversible. So some of us, I think, are focused on mitigation, not because we disrespect those other factors, but because this one literally has a time clock that I don't think any of us have ever seen before. A time clock that's measured in less than the amount of time that it takes to get somebody tenured. I'm again, not trying to minimize the heterogeneity and all of that, And we have to take all that into account. And these days, most people are trying to think about how it is that you do this. And that's why environmental justice is such a big and important topic. I was focusing on how do we just not blow up the planet? No, I didn't say that at all. I said, how do we do that subject to worrying about those other things? But in 30 minutes, I didn't get to all the nuance. Yes.
Thank you, Professor Tufano. During lunch, we were talking about artificial intelligence and climate change, and you are one of the very few professors who has been doing groundbreaking work on that. And we were even, talking about where the Salata Institute is located, and we were even joking about where its permanent office should be and where it should be next to the Artificial Intelligence Center here at Harvard. So can you tell us a little bit about the work that you are doing, you've been working on how to address climate change with artificial intelligence? Thank you.
So another part of my portfolio is I'm one of the 3 co-PIs of something called the D-Cube Lab on AI and sustainability. So we are precisely trying to do that. Can I be honest? I think we're trying to figure out how to make that work. So there's stuff that we can do on the edges. There's no question there's analyses that academics can do and analyses that other people can do. But now me speaking personally, I haven't seen the stuff get to the heart of this set of issues yet. So for example, we have a paper, very proud of this paper. We can analyze in great detail how it is that changes in weather on an hourly and daily basis affect the lives of everyday individuals and affect their finances and their health and all that. Great AI analysis. Whether it's going to move the needle or not, I don't think so. Our colleagues, however, at the School of Public Health, their AI models can tell you exactly, or pretty precisely, how it is that various particulate matters that come out of coal smokestacks have increased mortality. They've actually been able to kind of affect the rule writing process for emissions in the Biden administration. So I think we have yet to see. There's a lot of kind of fanfare about what AI can do in the climate space. I'm sure it can. But to date, the fundamental issue is how do you kind of reduce emissions of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases? And it's glancing blows, I think, for the moment. Because you need to go to hard-to-abate sectors. I think AI will be good, if you think about that Kaya identity. I think AI will be very good at kind of finding ways to improve energy efficiency. That'll be great, right? But fundamental decarbonization, not yet. Although having said that, there's some really interesting firms that are using AI to create physical product, new materials, like using AI to figure out how you optimize a concrete mix to reduce the carbon content of carbon. Yeah, that's great. But at the end of the day, it's an input into a process like that. So that may be less positive than you think, but I think AI is this wonderful technology, but I have not yet seen it have full impact on climate, even though I run a lab that's supposed to do that. Thank you.